Well, hi everyone, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Bob the Science Guy. I want to thank everybody that looked at and commented on my 7 questions Flat Earthers can't answer video this morning. And we have a winner. We have Mr. John Adams, who gave the best answer, in my opinion, to those questions. So let's go through them. Let's see what he got right, and maybe see what he got wrong. Let's have a look. Okay, the first question was, where do meteors come from? And if they come from within the atmosphere or under the dome, what accelerates them? Now, meteors obviously do not come from outer space. Here's a meteor that struck Russia in 2013. You can very clearly see where it entered the atmosphere, where the friction of the atmosphere heated it up, and eventually it exploded. They did recover a piece of this meteor, which was about 24 inches in diameter, in a nearby lake. Meteors come from the asteroid belts, and they range in size from a grain of sand, typical of what we call a shooting star, to small asteroids, including the one that struck us 65 million years ago and destroyed the reign of the dinosaurs. Now, what happens with meteors is they are already moving at a very high rate of speed relative to the Earth. Occasionally, one will actually hit the Earth. It's a pretty good-sized target. Now, when the meteor hits the atmosphere, if the angle is low, it will literally skip off the atmosphere very much like a stone skipping off the surface of a lake. If the angle's a little steeper, it will enter the atmosphere. The friction of the air will heat it up to the point that it glows, and it may even explode, as this one did. So, that's the answer to question number 1. Now, John's answer to this question was gravity. And that's actually a pretty good one, because most of the material that becomes meteors is in orbit around our sun, and that is controlled by gravity. It then interacts with other bodies and masses in the solar system, which alter that orbit a little bit, or it has a collision, and that changes the orbit to the point that it'll actually intercept the Earth and hit it. So I'm going to give him a good on that answer. The only thing that he really left out is what slows them down, and that, of course, is the friction of the air. So let's go on to question number 2. The atmosphere has a known pressure gradient that is easily measured from the base to the peak of a mountain. Even the bottom to the top of a building, you can measure a pressure gradient. So, how low does this pressure gradient go, at what altitude, and what stops it from going any lower? Well, the answer to that is rather complex. The pressure gradient is caused by the effect of the gravity of the Earth on the mass of the atmosphere. It pulls it towards the center of mass of Earth. Now, as a result, we have dense air at the surface of the Earth, which becomes thinner and thinner and thinner as we go higher. And as a result, the pressure of that air also decreases the higher we go. We can easily measure this from the base to the peak of a mountain, and it is the principle by which an aircraft altimeter works. So, where does this stop? And what causes it to stop? Now, one of the constant criticisms that flat earthers make against reality is that we can't demonstrate a pressure gradient from sea level to a vacuum. Well, in reality, we can. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. First, we can measure it directly. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is approximately 100 kilopascals. At 30,000 meters, or around 100,000 feet, that's dropped down to almost 0 kilopascals. When Felix Baumgartner went up in his stratojump balloon to 128,000 feet, there was almost no pressure up there. There was less than 1 kilopascal of pressure. That's why he had to wear a spacesuit. Now, we can easily demonstrate this in a couple of different ways. First, we understand the mechanism by which the pressure gradient of the atmosphere is caused, and that is the effect of gravity on the mass of the atmosphere, pulling it towards the center of the Earth. This is counterbalanced by centrifugal force and the actual energy of the gas molecules themselves trying to expand in all directions. A force is acting on those, pulling them back in one preferred direction towards the center of the Earth. Eventually, they run out of steam, and the pull of gravity is greater than their efforts and activities to try and escape. We do, of course, lose some lighter gases into space, but overall, the balance is there. Now, where does this stop? That's an interesting question, and we'll do a little deviation to try and answer that. Now, when you look at an airplane has got a wing. And the way an aircraft supports itself in flight is by generating lift due to a relative difference in the higher pressure below that wing to a lower pressure above it. This is a force that we call lift. When that force equals the force of gravity, mass times the acceleration of gravity pulling the aircraft down, it will stay up in the air. Now, how do you generate lift? Well, you move the aircraft at a velocity through the air to set up this pressure differential. It is related to the relative pressure of the air and the velocity of the aircraft. Now, as the aircraft flies near the Earth, it generates a differential of pressure between the bottom and the top of the wing, and that is sufficient to counteract the force of gravity. As the aircraft gets higher, the overall pressure is lower due to the pressure gradient of the atmosphere. As a result, the aircraft has to increase its velocity to balance the books, so to say, and generate enough lift to offset gravity. Now, gravity will drop away as you get higher as well, but the lift will drop away much faster, and in order to counter that, you have to increase the velocity of the aircraft. There is a point in the upper atmosphere where the velocity required to generate enough lift to offset gravity equals orbital velocity around the Earth. Now, when you reach orbital velocity, lift doesn't matter anymore, you're in orbit. And that point is called the Karman line. Now, the Karman line is 91 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, roughly. For legal purposes and convenience, we generally consider that to be 100 kilometers. But that is the edge of the atmosphere and the start of space. The pressure of the atmosphere at that point is 0 kilopascals. The pressure of space at that point is 0 kilopascals. As a result, you have two equal pressures sitting next to each other. There is no net movement between the two. Now, the next question is actually kind of interesting. It's a theoretical question because we can't really perform the experiment to do this, but our understanding of the atmosphere and Earth science allows us to exactly say what would happen. If you have a rigid pipe that is sealed on both ends and you evacuate all of the air out of that pipe to create a vacuum, and you set the bottom of the pipe at sea level and the top of the pipe at the peak of Mount Everest, where the atmospheric pressure is about a third of what it is at sea level, and then open the top, what would happen? Well, we have a vacuum next to air pressure at 1/3 atmosphere. The air from the atmosphere will rush into the pipe. When the air pressure equalizes in the pipe, the very top of that pipe will be at 1/3 atmosphere, just like the air around it. Well, what would the pressure be at the bottom of the pipe? Well, at sea level, it would be 1 atmosphere. And if you opened a valve at the bottom of the pipe, there would be no exchange of air because both in the pipe and outside would be the same pressure. That's because gravity would set up a pressure gradient within that pipe. Now, we can see examples of this on a small scale using a heavy gas like butane. Blue Marble Science did an excellent experiment with a pipe that was about 30 some odd feet long, filled with butane, and was able to measure a pressure gradient from 1 atmosphere of pressure at the top to 1.3 atmospheres at the bottom. I suggest that you have a look at his video. I don't know if it was 1.3 or 1.03. You'll have to check the video to be sure. But there was a definite difference in the inside of that pipe versus the outside pressure because the butane itself had more mass than air. Now, you can do exactly the same thing with air, you just need a longer pipe. And I've given you an example of one. Now, looking back at our previous example of where the air pressure stops decreasing It's at the Karman line, the edge of space. If you had a pipe that went from sea level all the way up to the Karman line, the top of the pipe would be in a vacuum. The bottom of the pipe would be at 1 sea level of air pressure, and it doesn't matter if both ends were open or only one end was open. The results would be exactly the same. Now the next one is a flat earth staple. How come snipers don't have to make adjustments for the Coriolis effect for their shots? Well, question number 4 was, how far would a sniper have to adjust his aim to account for the Coriolis effect on a 1,000-yard shot? Let's go ahead and have a look. Now, the key to understanding this problem is to look at the relative rotational speed of where the sniper is versus the relative rotational speed of where the target is 1,000 yards away. Now, at 45 degrees north, the rotational speed is the rotational speed of the Earth at the equator, 1,038 miles per hour, times the cosine of 45 degrees. And that works out to 733.977 miles per hour. Now, 1,000 yards north of that target, you can calculate the degree of latitude. Okay, 1/60th of a degree would be 8,060 feet. We're looking at 3,000 feet, so you can just do the math and figure it out. But the rotational speed there is 733.897 miles, and the difference between the two is 0.080 miles per hour. Now, you can convert that to feet by multiplying it by 5,280. Divide it by 60 to find out how far the Earth would move in a minute. Divide it further by another 60 to find out how far the Earth would move relative to the position of the sniper in 1 second. And then multiply it by 2.8, which is the flight time of the bullet. Now, if you do all that math and convert it to inches, you will find that the aim point will be 3.95 inches off of dead center. You will actually have to move aim 3.95 inches to the left of your target in order to hit it. Now, what's that mean in this situation? So here we have the crosshairs right over the bad guy. Now, if we fired a zeroed rifle at 1,000 yards, that bullet would strike approximately 4 inches to the right of where those crosshairs are. Now, 4 inches on this will be less than the size of one of those dots. Now, does this matter at a 1,000-yard shot with a sniper rifle? No, it doesn't, because a sniper rifle is only accurate to 1 to 2 minutes of angle. That is a circle which will contain 50% of the shots, that is 10 to 20 inches in diameter. So we're looking at probably a quarter of the technical limit of accuracy of the rifle to begin with. So no, it won't make a difference at all. Now, if you're dealing with a 16-inch naval rifle off an Iowa-class battleship firing 22 miles, yes, Coriolis does make an effect. How much? About 150 yards. You would literally, in the northern hemisphere, have to aim about 150 yards at 22 miles to the left of the target in order to hit it. In reality, that's not how any of this is done. That's why we have spotters to see where the rounds hit. That works for snipers. It also works for battleships. You use this to kind of get into the general neighborhood of where you want to be. And then you walk the rounds into target. So at 1,000 yards, a sniper is not going to need to make any consideration for Coriolis. Windage, spin drift of the bullet, these are things that have much more effect. Temperature, humidity, etc. Coriolis is a very minor effect at 1,000 yards. It's a much bigger effect at 22 miles with artillery. Oh, and by the way, as a bonus problem, this target's not 1,000 yards away. How far away is it? There is an answer, and you can see it from this. You know, the next one, number 5, is actually kind of fun. The Earth rotates at 1,038 miles per hour at the equator at sea level. Now, one of the things that Flat Earth likes to talk about is that as you went up in the atmosphere would have to rotate so much faster in order to keep up with the Earth, and what would power that acceleration? Well, my question was, okay, so what would the rotational speed of the Earth be in the atmosphere 50 miles above the surface? Now, John actually did a pretty good job of doing that. He used slightly different numbers for the radius of the Earth, and I'm not going to fault him for that. But he made a rather elementary mistake here that I think a lot of people might make. What is the formula for the circumference of the circle? It's pi times the diameter, not pi times the radius. So you actually have to double that difference from 50 miles to 100 to get the difference in the diameter. Now, if you do the math for it, you will find that the atmosphere rotates 50 miles above the surface approximately 25 miles per hour faster than the surface does. Now, considering there's almost no air up there, you wouldn't even feel a breeze. Now, does the Earth actually drag the atmosphere with it? Yes. Does the top of the atmosphere have to accelerate to keep up with the atmosphere at sea level? No. What it does, instead of accelerating to keep up with it, it actually lags behind a little bit. Now, the problem that you run into is if the lag up here is 25 miles an hour, that's not really the magnitude of the lag, because the air here will exert a frictional force on the air just above it and drag it forward a little bit. As a result, it may only be 15 or 20 miles an hour at 50 miles. But we don't fly at 50 miles. We fly at about 7 miles. So let's do the math for an airliner. What would the difference in the atmospheric speed be if you go from the surface up to about 35,000 feet or 7 miles? Well, about 1 mile an hour. What is the actual winds up 7 miles above the surface of the Earth? Up to 140 miles an hour. Completely inconsequential. Let's go to the next one. Now this one's probably one of my favorite ones. It has to do with if the Earth was rotating at 1,038 miles per hour at the equator, wouldn't we feel that? Well, of course we would. Now, the question for flat earthers is, what direction would we feel that force? Now, the answer is rather simple. Straight up. All right? Because the force that we would feel would be centrifugal force. Because as the Earth rotates with a rotational velocity, it's constantly changing its angle downward. And as a result, we feel like we are being accelerated downward, and we'd be pushed back into our seat, so to say, straight up. Now, can we actually see this on the Earth? Of course we can. I've done this myself. Wolfie 6020's done that, and so have numerous others. There's a thing out there called the Otvos effect. E-O-T-V-O-S. Look it up. Now, what the Otvos effect is as you sit on the Earth, you are rotating with the Earth. Now, your rotational speed sets up a centrifugal force that opposes the force of gravity. Now, if you fly with the rotation of the Earth, which is west to east, you are going faster than the surface of the Earth would. As a result, you have a little bit more centrifugal force pulling you away from the surface of the Earth, and you will actually weigh a little bit less. If you are going from east to west against the rotation of the Earth, you have less centrifugal force applied to you, and you weigh slightly more. Okay? You can actually measure this with a 500-gram mass and a precision scale that is calibrated to the latitude on which you are traveling. Now, the centrifugal force due to the rotation of the Earth is measurable because you weigh different whether you are at the equator or moving towards the poles. you weigh less at the equator and more at both poles, because at the poles there's no centrifugal force, and at the equator you have the maximum amount of centrifugal force. And this amounts at the equator to approximately 1/300th of the force of gravity. So if you weigh 300 pounds at the North Pole, you would weigh 299 pounds at the equator. Now, this is why scales have to be calibrated to their latitude. Now, if you do need to measure something very accurately and you don't have the ability to calibrate a scale, one way that you can do it is by using a balance scale, where you take a mass of a known amount and compare it to your test subject. Now, that will be accurate at any location, but if your scale is based on compression of a spring, you have to calibrate it. Now, while this next question, the final question, how do you calculate the airspeed of an unladen swallow, is considered by many to be a funny or a throwaway question, it's actually quite serious. How would you calculate the airspeed of an unladen swallow? And quite frankly, it doesn't matter if it's African, European, or barn. There actually is an answer, and right here is a paper on how to do it. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can do it. You can time the swallow over a course. The way that they're talking about here is by timing their migrations and also by photographing them, because as the swallow flies, it beats its wings. If you look at the time from the wing is up to the time it comes up again on a high-speed camera, you can not only time how long that takes, but you can see how far the swallow has advanced. And you can actually come up with an answer. So, for a European swallow, it looks like it's 11 to 16 meters per second. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed the quiz and the answers gave you something to think about. Many of you did very well. Some of you were completely lost, generally because you were trying to shoehorn the answers to this into your flat earth conspiracy story or your electric universe story. If you sit down and actually look at the facts of the question, you can answer them if you apply some logic and reason to them. Now, I'm going to do one last thing, and that is that I've actually looked a little bit into the argument of creationism versus evolution. And one of the arguments for creationism is that the environment that we are in had to be created to sustain our life, and that is evidence of intelligent design. A logical thinker would look at it from a different standpoint, and that is, we had an environment here and we evolved to thrive in it. The environment was not tailored to us. We were tailored to the environment. Which makes more sense to you? Part of doing science is being able to look at things in a logical and reasoned manner and make some good decisions as to what's important and what is not important. I hope that these questions and that last example I gave you might have helped a little bit. So, this is Bob the Science Guy. Thank you very much for stopping by. Be sure you hit that like and subscribe down there. I'm 2,800 subscribers short of my goal for this year. So if you enjoy this channel, this is your time to sit down and hit that little subscribe and like button. Okay? So we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for stopping by. Take care, guys.